All right, in chapter 12, we're going to go through the sexual disorders. Now, this chapter is really important because, one, that applies to everyone, not that everyone has a sexual disorder, but we're also going to learn about healthy, normal sexual functioning because that's important for understanding the disorders, right? And one of the really important things that we can take away from this chapter is that a lot of the sexual disorders grow out of misunderstanding of normal sexual behaviors. And what's really fascinating about American culture is that it's hypersexual, but there's actually really little sexual knowledge. And what I mean by that is sex is used everywhere in our culture. It's used to sell things, it's talked about, it's all these different things. Sex is very prevalent in our culture. Some people call us a hypersexualized culture, but at the same time, understanding of normal sexual behavior and the normal sexual response cycle is actually very limited. So a lot of people hear a lot about sex and they talk about a lot of sexual things and see a lot of sexual things, but they actually don't know about normal sexual responses. So this information, understanding it, can actually decrease the rates at which people develop sexual disorders because a lot of sexual disorders begin with misunderstanding. So a very important chapter. All right, so remember back when we were talking about schizophrenia, we talked about positive and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms were those symptoms of schizophrenia that were present that shouldn't be, and negative symptoms were things that should be present but weren't. Well, we can kind of think about the sexual disorders in the same way. We can split them into two groups, and that's what we're going to do as we talk about this chapter. The first section, we're going to talk about normal sexual functioning, and then when normal sexual functioning gets broken. So that's kind of akin to the negative symptoms, things that should be present but aren't, right? The negative symptoms of schizophrenia. In the second half, we're then going to transition into sexual behaviors that shouldn't be present but are, kind of like positive symptoms in schizophrenia. So you can kind of use that dichotomy as we talk about this. We're going to go through the first half, then the second half. So if you look at the chapter outline, this video we're going to cover some norms in sexual functioning. Then we're going to talk about the sexual dysfunctions, right, which are when normal sexual functioning doesn't work the way it usually does. Then we're going to talk about the etiology of sexual dysfunctions. I already mentioned one of those, which is just misunderstanding of normal sexual function. Then we're going to talk about the treatments for the sexual dysfunctions. Then we're going to switch to what I said is kind of akin to the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, which are sexual behaviors which are present, which violate the social norm, so shouldn't be present. So these are the paraphilic disorders. We'll talk about the etiology of the paraphilic disorders and the treatment of the paraphilic disorders. So break this down to some pretty small sections. So I'll try to keep my videos fairly short, but there might be more of them. All right. So what is normal when it comes to sexual behavior? The thing is that abnormality, just like when we're talking about mental or psychological disorders in general, is kind of normal. So there is a wide spectrum of what is considered normal. Again, it's just when things get on the extremes that we consider abnormal. And just like with all disorders, a lot of things aren't considered disordered unless it causes you distress in your life, right? So what's normal? There's a lot of variability. And a lot more variability than what a lot of people would expect. If you look historically, the Western culture was very Victorian for a long time, and the Victorian approach to sex was that having too much sex was causing people problems, and that sexual desires and impulses should be suppressed. And so there were a lot of issues around that view. Now our society has kind of taken a 180 on that, and now a lot of people's view is that sexual problems are caused by not being open enough or having enough sex, right? So very big cultural shift. And a lot of what led to that cultural shift was in the 1970s with the advent of birth control, right? All right, so let's see. And you can read in your book, there's some fascinating things like historically cornflakes were developed as part of your bland diet to reduce your sex drive. Didn't work, but that was the idea. All right, so in this table, and I know you can't see it, it's probably too small, but if I'll blow it up a bit, but these are the rates of percentages of people who engaged in different sexual behaviors during different age ranges. And the whole reason I want to bring this table up, and it's in your textbook on page 363 of your textbook, so you can definitely go ahead and read about that. But this shows how common different sexual behaviors are. And it starts with age 16 and goes through age 70. And you can see masturbation is common across sexes, receiving oral sex from a female, receiving oral sex from a male, giving oral sex to a female, receiving, giving oral sex to a male, vaginal intercourse, and then anal intercourse, penis, inserting penis into the anus, right? So you have all these different aspects of sexual behavior. And if you look at the rates, you can see that these are fairly common across ages and across genders. Now, and then the next thing, sorry, just real quick, LGBTQ individuals, about 4.1% of the population now. You can see with each different generation, the rates are higher, and across time, more people are identifying this way. And a lot of this reflects the cultural acceptance of these, where historically these were not culturally accepted. If you just go back into the 1970s, homosexuality was still viewed as a psychological disorder. We still have the category of gender dysphoria, which is highly debated as to if this is a sexual disorder. So we'll talk about that a bit actually. Actually, we're going to have an activity on that. So that's going to be one of your possible activities. Okay, so moving on. If you look at a lot of research, research shows that men think about sex more, engage in more sex, masturbate more, use pornography more, pretty much everything sexual men have at a higher rate. However, there are some research studies that bring this into question. Specifically, some research where people thought they were being hooked up to a lie detector. The rates between sexual behaviors between men and women were much more similar. And part of this is that researchers think that people might be conforming to gender stereotypes. So one, men might be more comfortable admitting all of this sexual nature, where it might be still somewhat of a cultural taboo for women to report it. And we do see that the gap between genders has narrowed over the years as female sexuality and the sexual revolution occurred in the 1970s, and women are much more comfortable with their sexuality now than they were historically, right? So it might be partially that, and it might be partially that men overreport, again, trying to fit into some stereotypes. However, research does support that men are engaging in sexual behaviors much more. If we look at the different sexual disorders, men are more likely to develop a paraphilic disorder, so those sexual behaviors that society say should not be present, right? In comparison, women are much more to have a sexual dysfunction, and that tends to stay consistent across ages. So men have more paraphilic disorders, women have more sexual dysfunction. The rates of sexual dysfunction in men tend to increase with age. We don't see as big of an increase in women. They tend to be more constant across the lifespan. However, women do have a lot more sexual dysfunction. Now, why is it so hard to get good numbers when it comes to sexual behavior? And the answer is that people lie, right? So if we look at some of the historic research done on human sexuality, people were lying through their teeth, which is partially problematic. And let me just give a really good example of this. In a recent research study done on the sexual behavior of adolescents, and they're asking how many of these teenagers, how many of them had had sex, the rates of sex decreased throughout high school. They weren't asking how much sex they were having, so it's not that people are actually having less sex. They were asking if they had ever had sex. And according to this research study, freshmen had more people had lost their virginity as freshmen than the percentage of sophomores who had lost their virginity compared to juniors, compared to seniors. Clearly, that is impossible, right? And really, what the researchers found was that these teenagers were lying about their sexual behavior. And that's a big problem with the sex research, that people lie. Another big problem with the sex research and the numbers that have been done over the years is that who is willing to answer these surveys. So if you look at some of the original research by Masters and Johnson, and what was his name? Alfred Kinsey? Yeah, Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey. If you look at some of the original research by these researchers, the people who were part of their studies and reporting on these studies were somewhat had a higher level of sexual deviancy than we expect exists in the general population. So if you ever hear a number quoted that just seems completely outrageous for sexual behavior, there's a good chance that it comes from one of those research studies. I remember years ago now, one of my colleagues said, "Whoa, Robert, did you know that this percentage of men report that they've had sex with a prostitute? And it was some absurdly high number. And I said to him, check the source. It's Masters and Johnson's or Kinsey. And he checked it. And he's like, you're right. How did you know? Because I'm like, that number's way too high. So I said, find a modern research study. And the modern research study found that it was about a quarter of the rate the Masters and Johnson's or Kinsey, I'd have to go find the numbers, reported. So if you ever hear an extreme number, always be leery of the numbers when it comes to sexual research. So this chart, though, is one that I quite like because what they did in this is they averaged across multiple studies to try to get a good idea of the rate that of sexual behavior in individuals. Okay. So we talked about commonalities, people lie. All right. Now, gender difference in sexuality have decreased over time. We already hit that. Good. Reported gender differences in sexual behavior may reflect response attempt to match cultural expectations. So in order to understand human sexuality, we need to understand normal human sexuality. Now, this is called the sexual response cycle. I'm not a huge fan of this graph because I liked another one better, but it didn't have things labeled the way I wanted, and I was debating which one to use. I probably should have put them both on here. But anyway, this is considered the normal human sexual response cycle. There are 4 pieces of the normal sexual response cycle. We have desire, arousal, orgasm, and resolution. Okay. We don't talk about the plateau. So those are the main 4 that we look at: desire, arousal, orgasm, and resolution. Desire is exactly what it sounds like, having sexual thoughts and thinking about wanting to have sex. Arousal is when the body starts going through the physiological changes of sexual excitement. So in a male, this would be an erection. In a female, this is increased blood flow to the sexual organs, right? So desire, arousal, orgasm, the pleasurable experience, right? And in men, this is accompanied by ejaculation the vast majority of the time. And then resolution. During this phase of resolution, a man goes through a refractory period where he cannot have another orgasm for a while. The refractory period, the length of it varies from man to man. Women don't have to go through this refractory period, which is why women can have multiple orgasms. However, there is one line that I wish was on here, which is where it comes up and plateaus and goes down without orgasm. And the thing that's really important for women to understand is that women's sexual response, depending on the study you read, tends to follow the rule of thirds, and this is considered normal. A third of the time they have an orgasm and then go through resolution, just like this black line. About a third of women have multiple orgasms, and about a third come up, they plateau, they don't have an orgasm, and then the resolution phase is much longer when that happens. The reason I want to point out those 3 common response cycles in women is because based on the research, some research, about a third of encounters end in each. So about a third of the time women have one orgasm and it's over. About a third time they have multiple orgasms, and about a third time they have a really pleasurable experience with no orgasm and then resolution. And the reason I want to point that out is a lot of times when a woman doesn't have orgasm, she and her partner start to panic in some way and go, oh no, what's wrong? And the man starts thinking he's a bad lover, and the woman starts going, what's wrong with me? Nothing, right? Unless that's a common pattern. And we'll talk about that more in the next video. But don't over worry about things. Worry and worrying about sex and worrying about performance and worrying about what's going on is one of the most surefire ways to develop a sexual dysfunction, right? So don't worry. About a third of the time each of these happen. Most women will have times in their life where they don't experience orgasm. That doesn't mean necessarily that something's wrong. Like I said, it's when it's a repeated pattern that we start talking about possible sexual dysfunction, right? So, all right. And this sexual response cycle, there's debate as if desire and arousal should be distinct, separate experiences for women. A lot of times women will go through arousal before desire. They'll co-occur. It's not as clear-cut. For the male, this cycle is much more clear-cut: desire, arousal, orgasm, resolution. But for the female, there's much more variability. Okay. So, desire, we already talked about sexual interest associated with arousing fantasies or thoughts, excitement, increased blood flow to the genitalia, orgasm, sexual pleasure peaks, resolution phase, relaxation, and sense of well being uh, that occurs. All right, so that's it for this video. Remember, there's a lot of variability in sexual behaviors, and also in sexual response. As long as it's not a repeated problematic pattern, don't overinterpret. Also, one quick thing to mention is that the longer a couple is together, the more consistently a woman has orgasm. And so, and one of the fascinating things is the way that we can get rid of a lot of sexual dysfunction is through communication. We'll learn about the treatments here in a couple videos down the road. But a lot of couples expect each other to be sexual experts, but they don't talk to each other. One of the silliest things that people do. If you want to have a good relationship in anything, communication is key. So if you want to do finances well in a couple or in a relationship, talk about your finances, right? You want to do parenting well, talk about how you're going to parent. Communication is key. The funny thing that a lot of people don't do is they don't talk about sex. The more a couple talk to each other about what they enjoy, what they don't enjoy, and sex, the better their sex life is. So don't be afraid to have those conversations, and don't expect each other to know what each other likes unless you have those conversations. Okay, like I said, we're a weird culture in that sex is everywhere, but we don't communicate effectively about sex. All right, that's it for this video. We'll pick up where we left off in the next one.